On Christmas Eve, the city went quiet in a way that made every light look like an island. Snow fell in slow, patient sheets, softening the hard edges of glass and steel. Maya Miller sat at her desk, the office around her a geography of small, single lamplights. Her computer clock read 11:47. On the corner of her desk, a travel mug steamed where she'd forgotten it minutes ago. On the other corner, beneath a stack of unpaid bills, lay a single letter, the bank's final notice about her aunt's reverse mortgage. The notice had become a question that followed her into morning, dinner, and back again to the office. Save the house or keep her head down and let someone else decide for her? The decision had the shape of a number in her mind, one she did not have. It also had the shape of things she had learned to do to survive: move, manage, arrange, keep the little quiet world of other people's obligations intact so her own could be postponed another week. She was almost packing up when the elevator hummed and the lights in the corridor rearranged themselves. He came in like a weather change, a shadow that filled the door before his shoulders, calm as someone who had never had to ask to be noticed. Finn Vale had an absence about him, which is to say he took up space without seeming to need it. His suit was dark as midnight and cut like a threat that had been taught manners. The men who stepped back from him did so with the kind of deferential rhythm that belonged to people who had learned not to be surprised by power. Maya had seen his face in papers and in her inbox. An article that called him a financier, another that skated around darker columns and used the word family like a brand. Tonight, up close, his eyes suggested an early frost, something held under a hard glaze. He moved without hurry to the far side of her desk, and there was a small, deliberate silence before he spoke. "You are Maya Miller," he said. And the way he said it made her feel measured. "You handle administrative affairs for Vale Properties." "I do," she said. Her voice surprised her with steadiness. He watched the little answer the way people watch the first fold of a letter they mean to keep. "I need someone to play a part for a few days," he told her. "I need to present as married. My family has a tradition. Appearance matters at the table. It will be easier if there's no rumor for them to bite on." She considered the word play. Easier, he said. Easier for him, perhaps, if the storm outside his house was made by his own hand. "And what do you want me to do?" she asked. She had rehearsed indignation. She had not rehearsed the steady, low urgency that left little room for moral theater. He put a small hand on a leather-bound notebook that looked like a relic. For a moment she allowed herself to catalog him. The fine line of a scar at his eyebrow, a silver ring on his pinky that was not ostentatious so much as inevitable, the absence of coat despite the winter. "Be my wife," he said. The words landed on the desk and made the lamplight look less lonely. "Just for the holiday, for family, 2, maybe 3 days. There are cameras in places that my family trusts more than they trust truth. They do not understand change. A husband calms them." He slid an envelope toward her. It was thick and heavy, and the inside smelled faintly of cedar. When she drew the single sheet free, a number stared up at her the way a door might. Large, impossible, the kind that made a person take inventory of their edges. There was a figure that would remove the immediate pressure, the mortgage, the catch in her aunt's chest when she mentioned the house. There was another line beneath it, compensation for her time, for her story, for the performance of intimacy beneath 100 curious eyes. Maya's hands were not nervous. They were practical. She read. He watched. The way she read as if he wanted to understand the small physical facts that preceded any choice. "You want me to lie," she said. "I want you to truth a lie," he corrected. "Tell them we've been together for 3 years. Say we met at a charity auction. If anyone asks, we have a history. There will be an inspector from the bank's legal team at the end of it. You'll have an affidavit to sign, performative, not a binding life sentence. I will pay you enough to ensure your aunt does not lose her home." She laughed then, a short sound that was equal parts relief and caution. That is a very modern proposal. He leaned in, the angle less threatening than resolute. There is one thing. You need to understand the ground rules. She read the rules like a weather report for the heart. There was an entire paragraph that made his voice turn slow with emphasis. Feelings are not permitted, he said plainly. We are actors. If either of us develops anything outside the script, if either of us begins to expect the other beyond the bargain, the arrangement terminates immediately. You will be moved elsewhere, discreetly. The relationship ends. No discussion, no negotiation. It sounded like a sentence written into a life to prevent a particular language from being spoken. It also sounded like a violation, not of her sense of herself, but of a small human expectation that proximity, even pretend, can create something messy and unexpected. Is that a legal contract? Maya asked, though she could tell the wording had been softened for her. He shrugged, a paradoxically small gesture. It is an agreement born of expediency. My family expects certain things. You should be compensated if you perform them. I am offering you a way to keep your aunt's house. I will not promise you anything else. The cashier inside her mind tallied the cost and the price. The house she had loved as a child, with its crooked banisters and the smell of cinnamon on winter mornings. Her aunt's hands when she folded blankets. The way promises made by banks sounded like small guillotines. The number in the envelope could cut those things loose and set ashore on a clear, gray morning. Maya thought about bargaining. She thought about what she could ask for beyond what was on the page. She considered the rumor of people like Finn Vale living in their own gravity, orbiting into eccentricities, able to offer absolutes with no exchange expected. And then she thought about the single lucid truth. This was a chance to save the house. If I do this, she said, what happens if I don't want to leave when it's over? He looked at her for the first time with something like pity, or perhaps warning. Then you will have to accept the consequences. The agreement is short on promises. It is long on indemnity. She signed. Her hand did not shake. When she slid the pen back into the holder, the city outside went on being dull and white, as if nothing had been decided in the room that smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. One more thing, Finn said, as if the pause were a private courtesy. You will be expected to respond to the name Mrs. Vale at family functions, for the sake of authenticity. She let the name fall around her like new clothing. Maya Vale, she repeated once aloud, testing the weight of it. Good, he said. You will be briefed. We leave tonight. She thought of calling her aunt from the bathroom and telling her the miracle of an anonymous check, the kind of lie that would gift someone a calm evening. Instead, she sent a text layered in practical falsehood. Working late, might be home late. The truth felt too small to carry the number in her bank account. If you love holiday romances, like and subscribe. They rehearsed in a quiet room near the lobby, where the security detail kept to the periphery and watched the movement of words as if they were rehearsing a play that involved no actors but had an audience of wolves. Finn ran his thumb across an invisible seam of his cuff and instructed her about the Vale family. Eleanor Vale, the matriarch with a face carved by winters of expectation, a younger sister, Clara, sharp in all directions, a father who had the habit of listening as though weighing coin. The rehearsed details were ridiculous and exact. Anniversaries, a charitable habit, the sort of invented intimacy that must be convincing to pass cursory inspection. Keep it simple, he said. Do not offer more than is asked. If someone probes, deflect with a story about a charity. My family respects philanthropy. Am I supposed to be able to describe your childhood? Maya asked dryly. You are supposed to be convincing, he said. There was a moment in which the man who drafted rules forgot their brutal edge and became simply a person issuing instructions, because that was the only language he trusted. If you make them comfortable, they won't look for a knife. The Vale estate was situated on a high knoll that looked over the harbor. The drive up was a narrative in itself. Stone lanterns, a gate that opened like a jaw for cars that had been cleared for entry, and the hush of the snow erasing the city until the house appeared like a ship grounded on a white sea. Finn's car arrived first. Maya's heart tapped a rhythm she had never taught it. There was an escort, two drivers who kept their faces polite and their eyes sharp. But the thing that made the house feel like a place that belonged to someone else was the way the servants moved. Not hurried, but exact, like the hands of a clock. The Vale foyer smelled of pine and the dry, sweet smoke of a well-tended fire. There were wreaths tied with deep red ribbon and silver candelabra, and the house had the fact of being very well built into the way its walls accepted the weight of winter. Eleanor Vale entered the room with the kind of quality that arrives already seated. Her dress was severe and long. Her smile was the kind a person uses when they're appraising an object they might be selling. She measured Maya with a look that catalogued her hair, her hands, the way she stood. "So," Eleanor said at last, "this is the woman." The family paraded forth like a collection of temperaments. Clara, who smiled the way people sharpened weapons, and a father who said a little and wore his silence like a statement. There were a few nods, the polite measurements of people testing a thing for authenticity. At dinner, they sat at a long table where single candles made islands of warmth. Conversation moved in careful tides. The Vale family's questions were not friendly so much as investigatory. Each probe felt like a tiny measurement, a test to ensure the fit of an imposter. Maya answered with the rehearsed simplicity Finn had given her. A story about a local charity auction, a mutual interest in philanthropy, an invented wedding in a small church. She found she could make the lines feel like she had said them 100 times. Finn's presence across the table was an anchor. He offered a small smile here, a slight nod there, and the weight of it redistributed itself into her chest like a hand. At one point, Clara slid a fork across her plate as though the move itself might be an accusation. "And how do you know each other?" she asked, not violent but curious the way a cat studies a new pattern. "Through work," Maya said. His company and I worked on a local housing initiative last year." The words tasted ordinary in her mouth. The room bent to the small lie and accepted it. "That's charitable," Eleanor remarked. She was already spinning the story into acceptable cloth. Charitable work can be comforting for those who need to be seen as generous. Maya kept her hands folded on the napkin. She felt like a seamstress who had been dropped into a room full of people who knew how to rip paper along the wrong line. Finn reached across the table, an invisible tether of touch brushing her knuckles. It was not a showy move. He pressed her fingertips with practiced casualness. A small warmth, like a coin placed in an empty palm. When the dinner ended, the house threaded them through corridors lined with portraits. The Vale portraits were not mere likenesses. They were maps of precedence, frames that recorded lineage like weather. Finn moved around the room as if moving through reefed sails, at ease with the language of this environment. At one doorway, a butler paused with a tray of glasses, and Finn's small correction, an instruction about how the glass should be offered, was received as law. They were shown to the master suite, which smelled of cedar and something floral that suggested opulence rather than genuine plant life. The bed was broad and made with the precision of an engineer. The view looked out over moonlit snow. For a moment, the room felt like a stage for intimacy that had been built, not earned. They rehearsed again in hushed voices. Part of their agreement included a public ring, something small and convincing. Finn produced a narrow band that glinted like a promise made in jest. "Put it on," he said, the command gentled by the context. Maya slid the band onto her finger. It had a weight that felt less like jewelry and more like an armor made to fit a new hand. Whatever this was, it would have to be worn in the presence of people who would look for every seam. The ring caught the lamplight and threw a thin white line across her palm. That night, Finn was restless. The Vale house kept a hush, but it was a hush that was occupied. Servants moving, footsteps muffled, the kind of living silence a large house does when it is performing sleep. Maya was half asleep when she heard a sound that turned the air small and urgent. A quick exhalation that was not part of ordinary breathing. Finn's breath was a landscape suddenly betraying weather. He sat up with a small human sound that would have been invisible in another life. Maya found herself awake, watching the way his hands sought something under a pillow. The tension in his shoulders, like someone who had been trained to hold a sword and now had only the memory of weight for comfort. "Are you all right?" Maya asked quietly. For the first time since the envelope had been passed across her desk, the formal language smudged. "I had a dream," he said without looking at her. The phrase was small and made the room less stiff. "My mother was young, and I was a child. There was shouting. I remember a smell like smoke." Maya sat up then, boots of awkwardness in the dim room. She kept her voice low and even. "Do you want to talk about it?" He made a noise that was equivocal. There was an oldness to the way he spoke, the kind of history that had carved itself into his ribs. "It doesn't help to speak," he said. "Dreams are not a ledger." She thought of the word ledger, of his instincts to account for every feeling, as if it might be a currency. She crossed the space between the beds in 2 slow steps, careful of the pretense that was supposed to be preserved, and sat on the edge of the mattress. Her fingers found the bedside lamp and dimmed it. The room folded into a shape where voices could be honest without making a public. "Strange people have strange ways of being brave," she told him, half to him and half to the night. "Bravery sometimes looks like refusing to admit you're tired." He turned toward her then, the shape of his face softened by the lack of light. Up close, the lines at his eyes were not merely the result of age, but of habit, the habitual compression of someone whose job it had been to be unruffled. For the first time, she saw the person beneath the performance, not unkind, but not easy to invite in. "You kept the house," he said suddenly. His voice was bare. "The house will be safe." Maya felt the rhythm of the sentence go somewhere private, toward gratitude, but also toward the complex ledger she had not expected he would keep. "You said you'd do that when we—" She stopped herself from saying if. The fabric of the fiction made an instant of its own. "I know what I promised," he said. "I know what I offered." Then, softer, "You did it without complaint." There was a quiet that fit between them then, not theatrical and not cruel, just the small hush people find when they are close to crossing a line and have not yet. In the morning, the house smelled like zest and cinnamon and melted snow. The Vale staff moved with choreographed precision. Eleanor's acceptance had been a slow, measured thing, but not a complete forgiveness. She watched them breakfasting as if examining evidence, and Finn's small protective gestures felt always calibrated. A verbal nudge to change a subject, a slight cover with his arm when a remark might itch at wheels beneath the surface. Maya found herself adjusting to the rhythm, moving like a guest meant to be imitated. The ring on her finger had become part of her hands in the way that a new habit does. Awkward at first, then present as a quiet fact. Later that morning, he led her to the library. It was a room that smelled of paper like a place that existed quietly on purpose. He opened a drawer and took out a worn book with a small dog-eared spine. The cover read Les Petits Princes, The Little Prince, its French title leaving a faint romantic dust on the air. For a man whose life seemed organized by pragmatism, the presence of such a book was like finding a pocket of sunlight in an industrial city. "This was my mother's," Finn said. There was a tenderness in the small fact that made the book feel less like an accessory and more like a map of private territory. "Do you know it well?" Maya asked. The question was not a performance. She genuinely wanted to know who he might be beneath the Vale name. He hesitated before he smiled, his first small, almost embarrassed smile. "I used to read it when I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "My mother would read to me about the little prince thinking he was being foolish." They sat on the library couch, and Finn handed her the slim volume. Some pages were underlined in a hand that had settled into the book like a quiet conversation. When she read aloud a line about grown-ups and the curious way they take themselves so seriously, he listened with a kind of attention that did not look away. "Do you draw?" she asked at one point, because the edges of the room suggested small domestic habits. He surprised her by handing over a small notepad and a stub of pencil from his pocket. "I used to," he said, "not lately. There's no time and no quiet." Her fingers brushed the pad. The pencil left a nervous, tentative line at first, then a curve that resolved into something like a bird. He watched her make the strokes, and for a moment the world seemed to contract to paper and graphite and the small sound of marking. He sketched a house, then added a small tree, then a little figure beside it. "That's my aunt's house," Maya said softly, when she recognized the crooked banister she described to him. The drawing was not perfect, but it captured a memory the way a photograph can't, with the kindness of someone who has noticed details others miss. He looked at her with something like surprise at his own impulse. "Keep it," he said, "a reminder that some things are worth doing." She folded the page and slid it into her pocket as if secret-keeping were an act of mercy. The book and the sketch had become small weapons against the performance they were trying to sustain, a private language that did not belong to anyone else. In the afternoon, Finn suggested they walk the grounds. The sky had gone a tender silver, and the estate's hedges stood as white sculptures. They tied scarves, and the air bit at their cheeks. The world outside the Vale House felt unmonetized, wind that didn't care how reputations were managed, snow that covered everything with a patient, impartial hand. They walked in companionable silence for a while, and then, with no fanfare, the snow grew thicker. Finn talked rarely, but when he did, it was in small, precise sentences. About the estate's old pine trees, about how the sea sometimes painted the horizon with a melancholy that pleased him. It was not a language meant to admit ordeal, only observation. The path was uneven in places, trampled half-steps showing where others had tried to make a straight line across the lawn. Maya misjudged a stone hidden beneath the snow. Her ankle turned with a clean, sharp complaint. Pain flared like a hot wire. She swore softly and went down, the kind of fall that could rearrange a person's balance. Finn was at her side before she had time to measure embarrassment. He scooped her under the knees as if the act were a reflex, and his arms carried a life made of precise muscle and obligation. She felt the air leave her chest in a startled whoop. There was a strange gentleness to the way he relocated her weight, like someone who moves things back into order without making a spectacle of the fact. "Can you walk?" he asked. "No," she said. The word was a small surrender. Her ankle pulsed, and the cold ran up her leg. He lifted her as if he had been carrying something he had always known was fragile, stepping over the hidden hollows in the path with the ease of someone who had practiced moving without making noise. The snow clung to the lower hem of his coat and made tracks like a ship's wake. People watched from windows, glances that were more curiosity than judgment. And somewhere, beneath the impact of the moment, there was the ridiculous truth that they were now somehow very much alone in the white field. Finn carried her to the nearest porch and set her down on a bench inside the covered entry, where the air was sharp with cedar and the house's heat came like charity. He removed his gloves and worked his fingers over her ankle with a care that felt ineffably private. Warmth seeped into the raw place. She realized then it was the first time in a long while someone had attended to her pain without ledgering it. "You're not," she began, meaning to say, "you're not supposed to be," to remind him of the clause. The sentence collapsed beneath the literalness of his hands and the care in the motion. "I'm not supposed to do a lot of things," he said, simply. "I did them anyway." There was no proud announcement, just a fact laid on the table. She let herself be quiet while he fetched a damp cloth and wrapped her ankle with careful, competent fingers. The bandage smelled faintly of a first aid kit on a yacht, sanitary and practical. The proximity of his hands felt less like the performance they'd agreed upon and more like something raw, human, the sort of thing that didn't fit neatly into a clause. When he finished, he did not withdraw his gaze. There was a hesitation so minute it could be missed, a micro-motion that spoke of an internal debate, whether to speak the truth, whether to risk the clean lines he'd drawn around his life. He caught the pencil tucked in the breast pocket of his coat and absently smudged graphite onto his thumb. The motion was painfully mundane. "You should rest," he said. "There's a sitting room near the service wing. They will bring you tea." She hoisted herself to her feet with a small, awkward wince. "I can manage. It's—" He lifted a hand, not in command, but in a small attempt at courtesy. "Let me," he said. They walked side by side to the sitting room in that particular intimacy of people who have shared a minor injury. No script for the way closeness feels then, just the immediate needs of warmth and quiet and a place to sit. The sitting room was small and smelled like lemon oil and old books. A fire made little sounds of contentment. A servant returned with a tray and left them with a look that betrayed both curiosity and the knowledge that some dramas were private, even in houses like these. Maya kept her head down for a while, feeling the warmth seep into the bandage. Finn handed her a mug with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple and true. For once, the ledger between them felt like a blunt instrument being put aside. He sat opposite her and watched the steam rise. For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. The house hummed around them with the sort of well-practiced life that belonged to people who had always known how to manage appearances. Outside, snow kept falling, and the world simplified itself into white and shadow. In the quiet, Maya reached into her pocket and touched the folded sketch Finn had made of her aunt's house. It was small and creased, and when she unfolded it and handed it to him, she realized she was offering something personal in return for the care he had shown. He took it, and for the first time, his expression changed entirely. He traced the pencil lines with a finger as though learning something new about the thing he'd drawn, about the house and about the woman who had asked him for a favor. "Tell me about it," he said. She told him. The way the porch sagged in one place because her aunt's dog had used it as a throne for years. The kitchen window that looked out onto the maple tree where she had once watched snow drop like confetti. Her voice made the house into an object of affection that wasn't about mortgage numbers or appraisal values. As she spoke, she felt the ring on her finger press a steady punctuation into her palm. When she finished, Finn did something small and unaccountable. He leaned across the couch, placed his hand over hers, and did not remove it. The touch was quick, but lingered in a way that made the room tilt. "We are supposed to be incapable of this," he said softly, as though speaking the fact aloud might keep it from being true. "But that is the thing about proximity, isn't it? It doesn't respect our contracts." Maya pulled her hand back then, gently. She felt the claws like a live wire beneath the carpet of conversation. Yet the warmth of his hand was still there, like a ghost on her skin. For a moment, the world narrowed to two people in a small room, a sketch folded in between, and the little ring that glinted like a punctuation. Outside, the Vale House glittered and prepared itself for the day's next performance. Appearances, greetings, the extended family hour. Inside, something unquantifiable had shifted. It was not yet a line crossed in a way that could be charted or cataloged, only a tilt, the kind that precedes a compass needle finding true north. The next morning, the Vale staff would prepare the house for the holiday's main event. A long table, speeches rehearsed in polite whispers, forks placed at exact intervals.
Maya would don a dress she had never wanted and make a speech she had never rehearsed in earnest. But as she sat in the sitting room with her ankle wrapped and Finn's hand still a memory on her skin, she felt the strange and unwieldy thrill that comes when the rules you were handed start to look like something made to be bent. The house shifted into its main performance with the late afternoon light doing its work through frosted panes, cutting the big rooms into ribbons of gold. Servants moved like the inner workings of a clock, placing crystal, straightening silver, setting napkins with the kind of care that makes extravagance feel inevitable. Eleanor supervised from a measured distance, eyes as precise as a curator's. Clara fluttered like a blade disguised in lace, asking questions that could be compliments or challenges with the same tilt of her head. The table was a map of the Vale family's priorities: places of honor, old silver polished to a mirror gloss, a centerpiece of evergreens and cranberries arranged like a fortress. Maya sat where she had been cued to sit, and the ring on her finger stayed a quiet, steady presence against the back of her hand. Conversation skimmed the surface: philanthropy, the port, the charity gala Finn supported, and was punctuated by conservative laughter. The Vale household had rehearsed being generous for generations. The generosity here came with the kind of calculation that dresses itself in kindness. Maya answered when spoken to, not adding more texture than Finn had practiced, but allowing small, believable details to land. Her role felt less false than she had feared. It felt procedural, like a manual she could read and follow. At some point during the main course, a cousin with more liquor than discretion remarked on traditions and love and the sudden arrangements people make when they're clever about appearances. Conversation would have continued on that thread had not Clara, with a softness that made it sharper, suggested a holiday custom, as if proposing a game. "We've always been a family for mistletoe," she said, with a smile that had an edge of challenge beneath it. "It's the sort of thing that reveals character. Those who resist are proud, those who accept are generous. Of course, none of us are particularly afraid of little traditions." A hush folded the table. It was the kind of moment that asked the room to perform its opinions. Eleanor watched with an academic patience as the net of observation tightened. Finn lifted his glass as if to toast the evening in the ordinary way, but his eyes, cool, assessing, flew to Maya's. There was a shorthand in his glance that had nothing to do with the script. It was the language of people who've always told a room exactly how to interpret a slight. Maya felt the air thicken. The mistletoe branch, hung in a doorway by a long-practiced hand, had become a small instrument of exposure. She could have slid her fingers into her lap and pretended not to see its hang. She could have stood her ground and refused the small performance. Instead, she found herself leaning into the current of the evening's momentum, feeling every gaze catalog her as she made a small, precise bow and walked toward the appointed doorway. Finn met her there, as they'd rehearsed in 100 minor, private ways. His hand found the small of her back in a move designed to be casual, part guardian, part spouse. But the contact sparked something else. Something private that had been gathered between them over the last days like loose coins in a pocket. Up close beneath the mistletoe, the room condensed to breath and the quick beat of two hearts that were not supposed to belong to one another. "Mrs. Vale," he said softly, perhaps using the name as an anchor for both of them. She could feel how the ring made the word heavier on his tongue. The air smelled like pine and cinnamon, of roast and a hint of something floral that came from the house's fabric. She looked at him, and in his face found an expression that was less a command than a question. In that suspended, exaggerated instant, the world outside the doorway retreated to murmur and glassware. They were two people who had been playing roles for the world's sake and had stumbled into a moment that felt dangerously unscripted. Without calculating, as if some private rulebook had been misplaced, they leaned. The kiss was brief, but it carried a weight that rippled through them both. It tasted faintly of wine and the residual warmth of the sitting room where Finn had bandaged her ankle.
It was a soft, necessary thing. Not a breach for spectacle's sake, but a confession the mouth couldn't keep private. When their lips separated, both of them inhaled as if surfacing. Their eyes met, and in Finn's she saw the same rawness she had felt when he had offered her the envelope in the office. An unbidden fragility that looked almost like regret. Clara clapped at the expected moment, and the room erupted into pleasure and commentary as though nothing sacred had been altered. Eleanor's smile was inscrutable as a coin. Yet beneath the practical banter, there was the faint tremor of something heavier, the kind of tremor that could be found in old foundations after a storm. They continued with the evening's choreography, but the kiss hung between them like a bell whose chime had changed their internal tuning. They ate dessert, exchanged polished conversation, and were admired for their chemistry by relatives who could not see the difference between performance and truth. Finn's touches were smaller now, less performative and more cautious. He seemed to measure the air as if it might collapse. Maya felt each of his adjustments like a ledger being rewritten. Clara clapped at the expected moment, and the room erupted into pleasure and commentary as though nothing sacred had been altered. Eleanor's smile was inscrutable as a coin. Yet beneath the practical banter, there was the faint tremor of something heavier, the kind of tremor that could be found in old foundations after a storm. They continued with the evening's choreography, but the kiss hung between them like a bell whose chime had changed their internal tuning. They ate dessert, exchanged polished conversation, and were admired for their chemistry by relatives who could not see the difference between performance and truth. Finn's touches were smaller now, less performative and more cautious. He seemed to measure the air as if it might collapse. Maya felt each of his adjustments like a ledger being rewritten. After the guests left and the Vale rooms exhaled back into their private domesticity, Finn closed the library door and leaned against the frame with his hands in his pockets, the small silver in his pinky catching the lamplight. He watched her with an intensity that was, for once, nearly vulnerable. "We broke the rule," he said in a voice that blurred the edges of his own policy into personal consequence. Maya glanced at the ring, then into his face. She could have said nothing, kept the moment unquantified, but she had built the fragile structure of her choices on truth as hard currency. The thought of lying to herself meant more than any performance. "We did," she answered, "and we both did. That was never meant to be part of the plan, but it is the truth of what's happened." Finn's jaw worked. "It changes things," he said. "The agreement, my terms, were meant to keep this manageable. If what we did is felt, then the mechanism I put in place takes effect." The mechanism, something they'd both known existed from the moment the pen had left her hand, loomed between them like a cliff. Finn's face was the same granite he wore into bank rooms and interview suites, but there was a tremor of private weather now that suggested the fortress had an interior life. "Then let's defer," Maya said suddenly. It was more plea than plan. "One more day, a week. Let the holiday end. Let me see if this is only the quiet madness of proximity." "Defer to what?" he asked, not angrily, but with the flat bewilderment people reserve for being held to their own rules. "The clause is simple. Feelings that begin to be expected end it. The purpose is to remove ambiguity." "And if we choose not to make it ambiguous," she shot back, "if we both choose to live like grown-ups and see what's true after the holiday? You can keep your clause as a threat if you like, but let's not end something that has just very unexpectedly begun." He watched her. For a heartbeat, she thought she might have swayed him. Then he said quietly, "If we do that, we invite negotiation." His voice held the weary weight of someone who understood the slow torpedoing of his own compromises. "I cannot." He stopped. He had trained himself to finish sentences with facts, but facts didn't line up here. "I will not promise arbitration when I promise the clause to protect both of us." It was a refusal couched as fidelity to a principle. the principle protected him, Finn thought, from the thing he feared most, the small, domesticated changes that would unravel the control he used like armor. It also, ironically, was the same principle that risked sending away whatever warmth had started to grow. They did not resolve the moment. Instead, they drifted to separate corners of the master suite and slept in the same bed with a distance that felt larger than the room. Late the next morning, before the table was set for farewell, Maya's phone vibrated with a message from a number she knew by rote, her aunt's bank. Her hands did something small and automatic. She checked. The figure that had lived in the envelope now appeared in a line item, funds released in a wire transfer. Her chest filled with a lightness she had not expected. The house would be safe. The sound it made within her was like thawing. She stared at the confirmation as if it were a relic. There were 1,000 little practicalities she had lived with for years. The smell of her aunt's kitchen, the loose tile near the pantry, the way the front porch sagged at noon, and they now belonged to her aunt again. The relief was such a plain human thing that her eyes blurred. For a moment, she was simply grateful. She carried the phone to Finn without meaning to dramatize the action. He looked up from polishing a decanter as if the world had landed in his lap. She handed him the screen. "It cleared," she said. Her voice was small. The wire came through. Finn read the message with the steady economy of someone trained to take facts as they are. He nodded. "Good," he said. The word was cold in the way small satisfactions are when a threshold has also been crossed. Maya set the phone down on the dresser and looked at him. So, then, she could not finish the sentence. The reality of what she'd risked and what had been restored pressed at the edges of taste. What happens now? Finn placed the narrow band that had been acting as their symbol back into his palm and trembled, a slight motion that would have been invisible to anyone whose view did not extend beyond the performance. He thought of clauses and expediency, and he thought of all the potential dangers that had been tethered to letting anything real grow in a life that needed to be tidy. "You should go," he said. The words were exact and measured, again fitting themselves to the policy he had created. "You could remain, but the agreement's enforcement clause is designed to remove ambiguity. You were clear about it from the start." Maya felt the room tilt. She had wanted to delay the rupture, to let the holiday breathe out something else. But her eyes traveled to the phone's confirmation and back to his face, and she realized, with a bruise of discomfort, that staying would mean being suspended, like an ornament in his world, present only as long as it served a purpose, never spoken for, always negotiable. "No," she said slowly, "I won't be a placeholder." "You could be," he replied with blunt honesty. "You could accept, stay, be Mrs. Vale in name while being everything else in your own head. The arrangement ends only if the clause is triggered. If you can live with that complication, the house remains saved. But if you want true clarity, I won't stop you if you leave." She thought of the way her aunt had made her tea, the habit of tucking quilts over waiting shoulders, the small dignity of a woman determined to hold on to what she had. There was courage in walking away from a set of glittering comforts, if those comforts required diminishing herself. She also thought of the way Finn had carried her, of his care, of the hand that had pressed warmth into her wrapped ankle. The house could stay paid, and she could accept this life of ambiguity, or she could choose the quiet integrity of leaving. "I won't be a placeholder," she repeated. The words were a choice hammered into a shape of resolve. "If this is only ever going to be a performative life for me, then I have to leave. I came here for an outcome that allowed someone to keep a place they love. I didn't sign up to be a ghost on someone else's mantle." Finn's face was an unreadable calm. For all his threats and rules, he was not without care. His refusal was not cruelty, as easily as it was fear. "Then go home," he said. "We will call it a change of assignment. Someone will manage the logistics discreetly." She packed with an economy that left no room for theatrics. The ring she left on the small desk in the master suite, its thin band a faint glint under the lamplight, as if placed there with a careful, unceremonious finality. She dressed in clothes that could be travel-ready and placed the sketch in a jacket pocket, folding it like a private flag. At the valet stand, Finn's two drivers stood in the shadow, hands folded. He did not attempt to stop her, not because he thought he had no right, but because stopping would mean asking her to surrender a piece of herself he had no right to expect. They exchanged a small, rueful look, an acknowledgment of the private reality that had been wrought in the middle of a public lie. He handed her an envelope with contact information, an assistance card, and the note that would allow logistics to be handled. It was the last formal courtesy of a man who ran his life by systems. "Take the sketch," Finn said quietly. He placed the folded page back into her hand. "Keep what matters." She kissed his cheek, in a gesture that had the economy of people who have nothing left to say, but everything inside to feel. "Goodbye, Finn," she murmured. The name landed like a benediction. She stepped into the car, and the veil gates closed behind her with a soft, bureaucratic finality. He watched until the car's taillights became two small stars swallowed by the snow. When he turned back to the house, its rooms seemed larger by the absence of the small warm things she'd brought. Her laugh, the tiny habits like twisting the edge of a napkin as she thought. He felt with an unpleasant clarity that something essential had been bracketed by his own rules and that leaving had revealed the consequences of his carefulness. For a few days he kept to his schedule in the way one returns to mechanical tasks when grief is too new for articulation. Meetings were clipped. The house moved through the rituals of reputation. But the veil world had been subtly rearranged. Finn found himself waking to search the room where she had slept. He found the sketch folded at the bottom of a drawer with traces of graphite smudged at its margin, as if he'd taken it from his pocket in a moment of weakness and then hidden it with a kind of shame. Work became an instrument of avoidance, until avoidance ceased to be sufficient. He found, in the empty intervals, a series of small things, notes she had left on napkins during rehearsals, a stone from the garden she'd pocketed, a tea-stained receipt for a pastry she'd liked, that accumulated into an inventory of loss. Each little artifact felt like an accusation. The house, for all its grandeur, had become a theater without its main actor. He realized, with a sting that didn't care how guarded his public life had been, that he had let the thing that mattered more than his rules go, because rules had been easier to obey than change. Change was messy. Change required him to step out of the structure he'd built to protect himself. He could devise reasons, protocols, prudence, the dangers of a life formed around his kind of power. But the truth that screamed truer than his defenses was that the house felt hollow without her. Finn canceled meetings. He sent terse messages to people who assumed schedules were written in stone. He spoke curtly to his staff and then apologetically. He was used to people stepping around his orders, but he was unused to being undone by the absence of someone who had refused to be a placeholder. He opened drawers for documents and closed them again without moving. He did not sleep properly, and for the first time in a long time, his body gave him small signals. The tightness at his throat, a taste of salt on his tongue that had nothing to do with food. He found the sketch again one night, tugged into his inside pocket, smudged where his thumb had been. He smoothed the folds and traced the lines of the crooked banister he'd drawn, and the memory of the way she described a house's porch came back with a tenderness that felt like contrition. He could have arranged another life of performances. He could have looked for another solution to the practical problem in the way he always solved problems, by buying time or papering over. But the thought of that solution made his stomach hollow. He had let someone who had been brave for another's sake go because he had obeyed rules meant to protect him from something he feared most. So he left, not with fanfare or the kind of grand gesture that would have satisfied some public narrative, but with an urgency that did not wait for committee approval. He put a few things in a duffel bag, told his staff he would be off his calendar, and stepped into the cold with a sensation like urgency burning under his skin. He did not sleep properly, and for the first time in a long time, his body gave him small signals, the tightness at his throat, a taste of salt on his tongue that had nothing to do with food. He found the sketch again one night tucked into his inside pocket, smudged where his thumb had been. He smoothed the folds and traced the lines of the crooked banister he'd drawn, and the memory of the way she described the house's porch came back with a tenderness that felt like contrition. He could have arranged another life of performances. He could have looked for another solution to the practical problem in the way he always solved problems, by buying time or papering over. But the thought of that solution made his stomach hollow. He had let someone who had been brave for another's sake go because he had obeyed rules meant to protect him from something he feared most. So he left, not with fanfare or the kind of grand gesture that would have satisfied some public narrative, but with an urgency that did not wait for committee approval. He put a few things in a duffel bag, told his staff he would be off his calendar, and stepped into the cold with a sensation like urgency burning under his skin. He did not know where she had gone exactly. He had a general idea of a city in the Pacific Northwest she had once mentioned as a place to get real coffee. He had contacts and resources that could find people quickly when he chose to. But this was not about resources. This was about taking a step he should have taken earlier, to go in search of an answer he had refused to admit he wanted. He flew that night with the kind of merciless speed his life afforded. The trip was a line drawn across maps and time zones. He let aversions to risk slide into the background because, for once, risk had a shape he could name, losing the chance to be with someone who mattered more than his rules. Maya returned to her aunt's house the way you come back to a place that holds your history like a safe. The house smelled like lemon and older sunlight. She walked through rooms with the casual affection of someone who had left pieces of herself there, and then set about rearranging things for daily life again. The sketch she had kept moved from her jacket to a place on the mantel where it reminded everyone that kindness could be simple. The house was not wholly restored to the way it had been before. There would be repairs and a slightly different cadence now, but it would be home, and her aunt's hands would not have to worry about the mortgage notice again. She took to mornings like a religion. Kettle, window, the hum of an early radio tuned to a station that turned ordinary weather into small company. She did not tell anyone about the mistletoe kiss or the way Finn had carried her in the snow. She filed it away in her private ledger of extraordinary, improbable kindnesses, and continued living, an ordinary life with an extraordinary secret folded inside. Finn arrived days later in a gray rain that washed the city's glare into a dull, honest sheen. The sky seemed perpetually on the verge of giving way to weather. He found himself walking streets whose storefronts smelled of coffee and the open hum of people who had not learned how to give deference like a currency. He moved through crowds with the awareness of someone who had not been used to anonymity, and found in that anonymity the rawness of being one human among many. He called friends who knew where she might be. He asked about a certain small independent bookstore she had mentioned. He tracked down the cafe she liked, and he asked the baristas with an awkwardness that betrayed his usual bluntness, as if apologizing for the presence of a man who had not known how to ask for what mattered. He was the kind of person who usually solved problems with a ring or an order. Now the problem was himself. He finally found her on a street that ran along the bay, the rain threading the air in thin, determined sheets. She was standing under the awning of a small shop, a scarf wound tight, the sketch peeking from her coat. He could have watched from a distance, silently, respectfully, but the distance only made his heart feel heavier and his hands longer for the possibility of touch. He crossed the street and waited for her attention in the small sphere of the rains falling. She saw him and braced. A rational, practical reaction. He could see in her face the residue of the Vale House, the way she held herself like someone who had defended the dignity of another's home and refused to be a footnote in another's story. "I'm sorry," he said immediately, the words coming out blunt and abashed and real. "I am sorry for making it a choice you shouldn't have had to make." She looked at him in a way that was both cautious and curious, as if assessing whether apology would be followed by a revision of pattern. "You built a rule to protect what you feared losing," she said, her voice steady despite the rain. "But the rule was also meant to keep other people safe from your life. You asked me to play a part. I accepted for reasons I will not apologize for. But I will not be someone's plan B." He nodded, as if he had heard the sentence and had it recorded for his conscience. "I know," he said. "You were brave. You chose to protect someone else, and I used a method to protect myself." His hands opened as if to show they were empty of excuses. "I didn't expect to feel what I did." Maya folded her arms against the cold and studied him. "Why now?" she asked. "Why cross a country for a greeting on a rainy street when you could have prevented 1,000 small injustices while she was at the Vale House?" "Because I finally understood that the thing I feared losing is not control," he replied. "It is the possibility of being small and ordinary and not completely contained by my own plan. I feared that more than I probably should have. I am not asking you to believe me because I said so. I am asking you to let me show you." Rain dotted his hair and darkened the collar of his coat. There was no feint here, no theatrical grand gesture. He reached into his pocket and drew out the narrow band he'd given her for the holiday's performance. It had been cleaned and shined a dozen times over at the Vale House, but now it looked like something fragile carried across the threshold. He held it out with a hand that was not steady. "I am not offering you the ring because it is proof of some arranged thing," he said. "I am offering it because it came to mean something else to me. It is a foolish symbol in the face of what matters, but it's all I have that both of us understand. I can't promise the world I live in will change overnight, but I can promise this. I will not invite you into my life as a performance anymore. I will not ask you to be anything less than what you choose." Her chest felt tight in a way the cold could not explain. This was what she'd wanted. Action, not platitudes. Proof, not policy. But even more than the ring, she wanted an answer to whether he saw her as a person who could be loved without the shape of his rules strangling her. She reached for the ring, not to take it as a symbol of a contract already written, but to close the small distance between them with a practical human motion. As her fingers touched the metal, Finn's face softened in a way that made his eyes look almost young. Instead of placing the ring on a finger as if to formalize a claim, he slid his hand into hers. "Then take my hand," he said, "not the band. Take my actual hand. We'll figure the rest out." Her laughter was brief and wet and utterly honest, one of the first times in weeks she allowed the sound to be unguarded. She slid her finger into his palm, and the city's rain stitched the moment into a shared, messy intimacy. They did not need a ring to make the world right. They needed the willingness to step outside the scripts that had defined them. They walked then without ceremony, side by side under the small shared shelter of an umbrella Finn had commandeered from the cafe. He was careful, not because he had to prove something, but because the carefulness came from the new practice of tending someone else. She listened to him speak about practical changes he intended to make, small things that mattered to her, like slowing the cadence of his demands, and bigger ones that mattered to him, like learning to let someone sit with him in silence without interpreting it as inefficiency. He listened and he learned, and she measured his words against his actions. They returned to her aunt's house the next day with little pomp and no announcement. Finn met the woman whose place they'd saved and managed a kind of proper, civilian courtesy that seemed to surprise both of them. Eleanor Vale's acceptance, when it eventually came, was slower and warmer than the public leadings of her had led Maya to expect. The matriarch's frosty edge softened into a more complex softening. Not a surrender to sentimentality, but an acknowledgement that family, even when performed, sometimes needed to be reinforced by genuine attachments. Over time, the Vale household adapted as well. Finn made deliberate choices that reshaped his calendar of obligations.
He did not flip the switch on loyalty to his family. Rather, he made adjustments so that his private life could exist without always being drowned by the dynasty. He introduced Maya into his world in small increments, with gentleness and with the permission for her to refuse. He learned to let someone else set terms on intimacy. He learned that being powerful did not mean he had to dictate the rules of another heart. Their courtship, such as it was a matter of small things more than grand declarations. He left a folded pastry on the kitchen counter when he arrived for a visit. She slipped sketches she'd drawn of the Vale estate into books she thought he might find and leave for her. They took walks in neighborhoods that had nothing to do with the Vale map of power. They argued about trivialities, how to fold a fitted sheet, whether their dog, when they eventually had one, should sleep on the bed. And in those arguments learned one another's textures. The little prince remained a talisman. On rainy evenings, they read aloud to each other, pages exchanged like confessions. The sketch of her aunt's house found a frame on the wall of Finn's study, where it sat among other artifacts. It looked less like a souvenir and more like an address that had given him a route back to something he had withheld from himself for too long. Months later, at a quieter holiday when there weren't cameras and the Vale house felt less like a stage and more like a residence with a family in progress, Finn and Maya stood in a room that smelled faintly of spice and evergreen. Eleanor had come to accept her as part of the landscape, not with the perfunctory assent of a ruler, but with the more complicated warmth of someone who had watched a small, stubborn love earn its place. When Clara offered a toasted conclusion about the unpredictable nature of family in the middle of that meal, Eleanor rose from her chair with a piece of fabric in her hands. It was old, gentled linen folded with the care given to heirlooms. She placed it on the table between them and, with a face that had aged into more interesting things than severity, let the logic of her acceptance be in action. "In our family," she said, with a voice that carried both the weight of precedence and a new willingness to adapt, "we value what holds us together. You, Maya, chose to save a home because you loved someone who deserved it. That, to me, is an action worth recognizing. Finn," she paused and looked directly at her son, "you've been stubborn in ways that scare me and brave in ways I did not expect. If the two of you will be proper and persistent, know you have a place here." It was an old-fashioned kind of blessing, less ornamental than it sounded. She reached into the linen and revealed a small bundle of infant clothes, tiny, embroidered pieces so worn in they looked like they had already been loved. "They belonged to my brother's first child," Eleanor said softly. "If you ever find yourselves keeping a home with more small sounds, perhaps these will be useful." The room breathed. Maya's throat tightened with something that was part gratitude and part astonishment. The acceptance she had feared might never come now arrived in the form of practical, tangible tenderness. It was not a dramatic wash of capitulation. It was a small, steady folding in. The family ritual had adjusted its choreography to make space for honesty. In the quiet months that followed, their life moved toward a domesticity that felt both ordinary and miraculous. They purchased a small house that had a sagging porch reminiscent of the aunt's home, but without the anxieties of a reverse mortgage. The cottage filled with books and drawings and the little clatter of dishes. Finn, who had been used to rooms designed for impact, learned the rhythm of washing a cup to keep it shiny for someone else's use. Maya found herself teaching him how to make a proper tea, and he, in return, took to standing in the doorway with a cup for her in the mornings when it was raining and she had not yet roused herself. One spring brought a new kind of laundry, tiny socks, a small stitch of life that took them by surprise. The pregnancy, announced with a folded card and a sketch of tiny shoes, was a private thing that became, inevitably, theirs to share a little at a time. Finn's face, when he learned, was a study in wonder. He paced the living room once, then returned to her and simply held her, a way he had developed that spoke care without grand pronouncements.
Eleanor's acceptance continued to deepen in small, important acts. She brought the infant clothes out of their linen and handed them to Maya with an almost shy tenderness that made the gesture feel like a blessing. "They are small and plain," Eleanor said one evening, passing a bundle over, "but they have been loved before. That is how family is made, through the passing on of a few useful things and the will to keep them." They laughed, wet with tears, and the tiny garments became more than cloth. They were proof that the ark they traveled had a future. The community around them adjusted as well. Finn found that power had less to do with the things he controlled and more with how he chose to protect the people he loved without consuming them. He still carried the weight of his family's expectations, but he no longer let those expectations write the margins of his private life. Maya's aunt no longer had to worry about bank notices, and the house on the corner retained its crooked banister and the smell of cinnamon at Christmas. Their wedding, when they finally arranged one, was small and chosen for its honesty rather than spectacle. It took place in a chapel that smelled faintly of beeswax and old wood, with friends and a softened family in attendance. Eleanor gave a reading that had none of the Vale House's chilly perfection. It was warm and funny and human. Finn held Maya's hand in a way that suggested he had learned to inhabit small realities without turning them into battlegrounds. A year from the night they had first met at her office with cedar-scented envelopes and the city sleeping, they celebrated a Christmas that tasted less like a performance and more like contentment. Snow came down with a patient kindness, softer than the first arrival on the night of the favor. They stood by a small tree whose lights blinked like the city, a few years ago when anything had seemed possible. The little Prince book sat on a nightstand beside a stack of newborn onesies and a sketch of the old house that had started everything. Eleanor, who had once measured people as if appraising art, stood beside them and placed the tiny bundle of heirloom clothes into Maya's hands.
She looked at her daughter-in-law, at the woman who had saved a house and refused to be a placeholder, and something like approval softened the line of her mouth. "You kept your home," Eleanor said, voice steady. "You kept your dignity, and you kept him honest." They all laughed, a small family laugh that was both private and public, the sound of people who had been through negotiation and compromise and had come out the other side with a new vocabulary: humility, acceptance, affection. That night, after guests had gone and the house settled into the easy hum of people who had eaten well and been glad, Finn and Maya sat by the window with the city's lights blurred into gentle rubies. The rain or the snow, depending on the mood of the weather, came as background music. The baby cooed nearby. Finn reached for her hand under the throw and held it in a grip that was no longer about possession, but about partnership. "I could have lost you," he said softly. "You did," she murmured, leaning her head against his shoulder with a contented sigh. "You still had to find me again." He kissed her forehead, a simple, inexact thing that carried all the apologies and promises a person can give when they have learned to change their rules. Outside, the city went on its indifferent spinning. Inside, a family, complicated, stubborn, and very much real, made its own weather. The ring sat on her finger, not as a symbol of an arranged life, but as evidence that two people chose to be present for one another through the small humdrum affairs and the dramatic weather of human feeling. If you're watching and this story moved you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what holiday sacrifice resonates with you most.